right. Hey everyone, I am Alex Joseph. I've been a CA here at OCG for about 2 years and with OCG for about 3. Prior to that, I was working at a small biotech startup here in Denver. And before that, I actually worked managing a core facility at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I'm Ryan Grech. I've been working as a contract administrator with the Office of Contracts and Grants since December 2019. Before coming to CU Boulder, I worked at the San Jose State University Research Foundation as a pre- and post-award analyst for their sponsored programs office. Currently, I'm primarily supporting about half of the departments on campus, including series, aerospace, and computer science. Over the course of the in-depth today, Alex and I are going to be going over NDAs and how contract administrators handle them. We wanted to focus on a few main areas. One, talk about the need for NDAs and how the university views them. Then we're going to discuss if all NDAs are needed. After that, we'll look at how PIs and DRAs can initiate the NDA process, what the procedure is, and how detailed the request form should be. We'll also cover the review process and hope to shed some light on what we at the Office of Contracts and Grants are looking for when we get those sponsored templates insisting, hey, we need this, we need that. And lastly, this presentation is going to cover what steps to take when a PI has already disclosed information and upcoming improvements that will hopefully expedite the NDA process for all campus stakeholders.
So as Ryan mentioned, the first thing we're going to talk about is why we sign NDAs in the first place. OCG has a strict policy that limits the purposes that we sign NDAs for. And if you take away anything from this presentation, hopefully it's that these two purposes are to evaluate a potential business relationship or to develop a joint proposal. Again, the only reasons that Ryan and I are authorized to sign NDAs. We won't sign them to share confidential information for ongoing sponsored research or for subawards. And this is actually confusing for a lot of our sponsors, as they're accustomed to all-encompassing NDAs that span from initial conversations through a project if one ends up happening, all the way to closeout NDA. We don't do this for several reasons, and I'd be happy to explain that further if it would be of interest to anyone. But for now, just focus on our two stated purposes, and we'll repeat this a bunch throughout the presentation: evaluating a relationship and writing a joint proposal. We like to refer to these as strictly relationship building NDAs. There are some fringe cases, you can see this other bubble, where we sign NDAs for purposes outside of these two, but they're rare and require a ton of internal coordination and additional approvals. The bottom line is if it falls outside of one of these two purposes, we will either treat it as a different agreement type, or it will possibly fall to another department side. Ryan, I think you had next slide.
There we go. Thanks. First and foremost, we want these NDAs to protect the PI. This is why contract administrators aim to have the NDAs scoped for a very specific purpose so that discussions can take place quickly and no additional burden is placed on continuing their research. Without an NDA in place, all PIs on campus will run into an issue of generating more risk that can impact both themselves, their work, and the university. Often the lack of an agreement or the use of an incorrect agreement type means there could be a delay in publication results, delay in patent applications, or even giving third parties the ability to commercialize CU information without consequences. Some of you may be wondering, why is delayed publication listed as a risk? It seems relatively tame compared to patents and commercialization. But in a worst case scenario, the university's status as an academic institution is put at risk when we allow another party to review and hold final authority over what can and cannot be published, which is often a sticking point for a lot of industry partners who want total control over their intellectual property. Contract administrators can offset those roadblocks by using material transfer agreements or data use agreements as two optional contractual vehicles that OCG would rely on to handle those requests. Or at least we will once it's clear that materials or data are being provided for such research purposes or a clear scope of work is established. Keep in mind too that contract administrators are just the initial point of contact regarding these requests. We're not technical experts, nor are we experts on intellectual property laws and restrictions. So because of that reality, our office works in conjunction with venture partners and the Office of University Counsel to make sure any signed contract, whether it be using a university template or a sponsor template, is done with the university's interest in mind. And also, if any of you are in the audience are skeptical or believe that a CU PI wouldn't go outside of the scope of an NDA, just know that within a few months of me starting at CU, we had a situation where a PI received materials under an NDA that was executed in 2018, then chose to inject that material into a person without notifying the provider. Because the initial NDA did not have publication terms or language around the use of the material, the PI was unable to publish the results until CU and the material provider could come to an agreement after the fact, which in the end took about 5 to 6 months to resolve. So keep in mind that the weeks or months it may take to generate or to get an NDA in place is worth it when compared to the months-long headache of trying to get unrestricted publication guaranteed after a PI has already completed their research.
One of the first questions that we as contract administrators ask ourselves when we receive an NDA request is this actually necessary? I'll say that a good majority of our NDAs are with industry partners who want to be involved and potentially fund research here at CU. In order for them to make that determination, they want to have a conversation with our PIs to see if their scenario is a good fit for the technology or the expertise that the PI can offer. This will usually require the company and the PI to both disclose confidential information to make that determination one way or the other, but not always. Industry partners are accustomed to handing out NDAs anytime there's even a possibility of disclosing something sensitive, just to make sure all the bases are covered. And while this is totally understandable from their perspective, it's not how we operate at CU. As we previously mentioned, we try to weed out any unnecessary NDAs when possible. So when a PI receives a request for an NDA, we want them to submit that to us as soon as possible. It's our job to do all this triage. But the points on this slide are good to keep in mind, because if we come back and say that we don't think an NDA is actually necessary and you can go ahead and have this conversation, it probably has to do with one of the following points. This information is also very helpful to include if you have it at the time when you're submitting the NDA request form. So believe it or not, the answer to the first question isn't always yes. If both parties are disclosing and that disclosure is necessary in order to evaluate the relationship, then yeah, we definitely want to put an NDA on that. But if the discussions can be held at a high level without disclosing confidential information, we can skip an NDA altogether. The way we like to put it is, if you can explain how the sausage is made without revealing what's in the sausage, you're probably fine. The second point, I've touched on this a bit already, but a lot of our industry partners send out NDAs as kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the possibility of having a conversation. These are the cases where we most often see NDAs being withdrawn as unnecessary. And the final point is probably the most important one. And it's a question of whether or not we are still truly in the evaluating a potential relationship phase. If we've already had discussions and both parties are confident that we want to move forward, we can skip the NDA. This isn't to say that we don't want to put terms on disclosing confidential information, but if that's going to happen as part of the project, it will need to be included and renegotiated within the sponsored research agreement. It's our policy that we don't incorporate the terms from an NDA by reference into the sponsored research agreement. I'd be happy to elaborate more on this if anyone would like. But all you need to know is, at this point, signing an NDA would be supported.
Okay. So on to initiating an NDA. How should DRAs or PIs initiate the NDA review process with the Office of Contracts and Grants? First things first is to submit an online request form. Oftentimes, we will be notified about a potential NDA by email, which is great. We love the heads up, but OCG can't move forward with just an email saying an NDA is needed. That's why we have the request form, and it's the biggest step for contract administrators. Without that form hitting our inbox, we're unable to assign the request to the correct person, and it slows down our data entry and review process. The links provided on this slide will take you to the request portal. If you need a refresher on how to submit a form, the instructions are also on the slide as well in the first bullet point. For any question about what to include in the request form, just stick to the general idea that the more information, the better. Contract administrators have the ability and knowledge to determine what is relevant and what is not. When we have questions about information that was provided on the form, we will reach out to the individual who submitted the request form in order to clarify. Questions regarding the status of an an intake form, you should reach out to either the OCG contracts general email or the contract administrator assigned to your department. If you're unsure who is assigned to your department, you can always check the OCG directory, which is also linked on this slide. And for everyone's awareness, OCG has been working on updating the request form and migrating its editing access to OCG. So there is an updated form in the works for all agreement types that will be released publicly within this year. And then as an example of what we would like to see on the request forms, we took an example from series that came in last month. On the left is a partial copy of what the request form looks like on our end. And on the right was an additional attachment sent in by the DRA. So for context with this form, back in March, I was contacted by Chelsea Nagy about a different but related NDA for the same group of series researchers. And once I emailed Chelsea back with some questions, I had also CC'd series DRA Ted DiMaria on the emails just so that the PI and the department were in the loop when it came to any delays or questions about the agreement. To my surprise, he was not aware of the request being sent or what the request entailed, which was a little bit shocking because he's usually so on top of all the requests that PIs have. So long story short, a meeting was held and then the end result was what you see on the screen. So whenever possible, series is sending these thorough and informative request forms that cut down the internal back and forth between series and OCG. If you look at the attachment on the right, you'll notice that he provided all of the sponsor contacts and all of the CU admin personnel that need to be included, in addition to giving us the NSF solicitation number, which is extremely helpful for any contract administrator that has to review and then do the data entry for the NDA request.
So as you can imagine, contract administrators take NDAs very seriously because we know that they can have strong and potentially negative ripple effects that can impact our PIs and their research down the line. So for that reason, negotiating and signing these things can take quite a bit of time depending on the circumstance. This isn't a comprehensive list, but these are some of the reasons that an NDA can take a long time to get through our pipeline. So CU has a set of over, I think, up to a dozen, maybe even more than that now, pre-approved NDA templates that were written by our Office of Legal Counsel. We almost always start negotiations by drafting one of these and offering to use it as a starting point, even if the sponsor has already sent us one of theirs. And we do this not to be difficult, but rather because we find that it often eliminates a lot of the early edits that we find ourselves making on every single sponsor template we receive. This happens because our industry partners are much more flexible than we are because they aren't bound by state and federal laws or region policy that dictates what terms CU can and can't enter into under the NDA. Our templates are written with different sponsor types in mind, so we can pick and choose one that's less likely to have issues for, say, a domestic industry sponsor versus a foreign university. If we do have to go with their template, it takes quite a bit of time to mark ups to make sure it's acceptable to CU. NDAs can be extremely simple or extremely complex. We will often send our template to a sponsor. Sometimes they won't request any edits and will return a signed copy within a few hours. We do see a few common circumstances that increase the level of complexity, and we'll talk about today are international sponsors and multi-party NDAs. International sponsors add complexity because we often find it hard to come to terms with them regarding governing law, and they seem more reticent to accept things like CORA or CGIA, with being the Colorado Open Records Act and the Colorado Governmental Immunities Act. I think Ryan's going to talk about these a little bit later. These are two Colorado state laws that we are required to include in all agreements we sign. This takes a bit of explaining on our end, and while we're usually successful at inserting them, it takes time. If they refuse to agree to our governing law, or at the very least stay silent, we actually have to go and seek a signed waiver from the Chancellor's office, which extend the process even further. Multi-party NDAs are more rare, but happen often enough that we have a template for them. As you can imagine, they're complex simply because of how much more work it takes to get 3+ parties to come to agree the terms than it does 2. Also, we're hindered by the sheer volume of NDAs that we handle at any given time. Ryan and I right now are responsible for negotiating and signing all the NDAs that come through OCG. That's in addition to MTAs and DTUAs that we also receive. Given that we receive anywhere from 20 to 30 NDAs a month, they build up pretty quickly. An NDA can often require a few hours of focus to come through and edit, and we send it back to the sponsor. They do the same thing, and if we go back and forth on this a dozen times, that really adds up.
Excuse me. All right, so as a continuation of what may be delaying an NDA from being executed, Alex and I wanted to go over some examples of problematic language that contract administrators have to be on the lookout for when reviewing another party's template. So without further ado, the Charles E. Cheese Corporation has approached CU's top indoor recreation researcher to help design a better ball pit. One of the sections in the template is a requirement for binding arbitration. CU cannot agree to binding arbitration. In the case, it has to do with the university's status as a public state institution. Most public institutions in Colorado are governed by a Tabor agreement, which prevents the university from agreeing to cover an unobligated balance on behalf of the taxpayers. So in simpler terms, the state cannot commit funds to the university if they were not previously assigned to CU in the annual state budget. Another example of financial restrictions that would need to be removed is that the agreement states that CU would cover the cost of lawyers or legal fees that arise from a court case or dispute. CU would simply prefer that each party take care of their own costs in relation to the agreement. Another example of financial restrictions that may also pop up in the template would be indemnification, which CU cannot agree to either. For the same reasons as mentioned in the previous slide, agreeing to indemnify Chuck E. Cheese means CU is agreeing to take on the cost for all liabilities, damage, and losses that arise out of the misuse of their confidential information. Another way of identifying indemnification in an agreement is when a template mentions holding a party harmless. This is again something that CU cannot accept, and contract administrators have to be on the lookout for every variety of indemnification language when we review an NDA. In addition to those state finance restrictions, there are state laws that CU has to comply with, which necessitates their inclusion into all of our NDAs. The two most important being the Colorado Governmental Immunities Act and the Colorado Open Records Act. For those that are unaware, CGIA is a statute that provides legal immunities to the university. Since the law is unclear on whether or not accepting another governing law of a foreign state is an implicit waiver of certain immunities, the university certain immunities that the university has as a state institution, the university has found it prudent to ensure that no ambiguity exists regarding any potential perceived waiver of the university's rights as a governmental entity. As such, this is another layer of language that the university requires whenever a sponsored template is used. For CORA, the same thing could be said. This is a state version of the Freedom of Information Act. As a statute, it allows members of the public to request access to public records maintained by public institutions that are subject to specified expectations. Since the University of Colorado is an institution of the state of Colorado, we are subject to the act. There are exceptions for specific details of bona fide research conducted by a state institution and for third-party trade secret and confidential information. However, this is still another section that can slow down a negotiation when a sponsor is unfamiliar with the act.
So in addition to the problematic NDA terms that Ryan just described for us, we also come across terms that are completely inappropriate for our purposes of relationship evaluation. For instance, here, Mr. Cheese has inserted language that requires us to transfer a ball prototype to them for evaluation. This is something that would be suited for an MTA, and if we circle back with the PI and check in to see if they are planning on sending something to the Cheese Corporation, we have to take a step back, shift gears, and renegotiate this as an MTA, which requires its own set of approvals and review. Mr. Cheese also wants to lay out terms that dictate the ownership and use of results. But again, because this is just an NDA to cover preliminary discussions, we shouldn't be generating any results. This is common when we see sponsors trying to implement the one-size-fits-all NDA that I talked about previously. And so Ryan or I would have to remove this completely because it doesn't fit our purpose. Cheese Corporation has also included something resembling the scope of work by stating that CU shall perform ... Again, just going for preliminary discussions here. Anything beyond that is not a deal. Finally, they included some generally problematic terms requiring that we submit publications to them for approval. This probably shouldn't make it into anything that CU signs, as it poses a publication restriction and push us for research territory. If an NDA is going to say anything about publication, it should really only say something like, nothing in this agreement shall constitute a publication restriction. But again, this is outside the scope of our NDA, so we would try to negotiate this out. These are all terms that are way beyond the evaluating phase and would indicate a more robust agreement needs to be put in place. Ryan and I would both have to go back to the sponsor, having significantly added all these down to the title.
Okay, what to do if information is already disclosed? Number one, don't panic. It happens more often than you think. In a situation where a CUPI has already disclosed information, OCG can draft an agreement that is backdated to cover all discussions that have taken place from that initial meeting. Obviously, we don't recommend that you do this, but it has happened before, so there are steps in place that we can use. What should you do when a PI comes to you saying they've signed an NDA on behalf of the university? Since the PI is not granted signature authority on behalf of the Regents of the University of Colorado, the agreement would not be in effect. The only time a PI can sign an NDA is when they do so as an individual and not as a CU employee. Once a PI is signed as an individual, they would be doing so under the 1/6 rule and would need to update their DIPA with COIC. OCG does not need to be informed of any NDAs that the PI has signed in an individual capacity. But another thing to keep in mind is that by signing as an individual, the PI is taking on all of the risk associated with that agreement and will be unable to use or access CU facilities for any work or consulting related to that NDA. That would also include the ability for the Office of Contracts and Grants to advise or review any follow-up agreements or NDAs. Some of you may be asking about students and can they sign NDAs? Students do not have principal investigator status and therefore cannot be listed as a PI without special approval from the dean, chair, or institute director. Grad students would need to have a title of RA or TA, and even if that's the case, OCG would still prefer to have the PI listed as the technical contact on the NDA, so long as the agreement outlines the student is under the supervision of the PI. Just like the issue of a PI signing is as an individual, contract administrators are university employees and they are there to assist researchers employed by the university. So bottom line, the delegation of signature authority for NDAs is held by OCG. CU Boulder PIs cannot sign NDAs or any other agreements on behalf of the university. Additionally, CU Boulder does not sign NDAs on behalf of unpaid students as a part of their participation in capstone courses. And CU Boulder advises companies not to engage students in NDAs because CU Boulder has no recourse upon graduation.
Fortunately for everyone in this virtual room, we have several things in the pipeline that are going to make all of our lives significantly easier over the next few months. We hired 2 talented new CAs last year. And they're both starting to negotiate these agreements on their own. You may have seen them CC'd on emails, Kate and Grant. She almost made it. So Kate and Grant are going to help us start negotiating these. And soon we're going to be able to redistribute our department assignments. That's going to let us devote more time to each request we receive. In addition, we're ready to release updates on our NDA request form. It's going to be a little bit more work on the submission end, but what we're hoping it's going to do is reduce the amount of back and forth we have to do with our PIs and with our BRAs before we reach out to the sponsors. In addition, we're working with OUC to update our templates. Because Ryan and I have now been in this position for a few years, we're both pretty familiar with some of the common sticking points that our sponsors have, and we're going to work to soften some of the language to make it more acceptable for them. Hopefully, we'll have that beautiful case scenario where they send back no edits. We also want to put it out there that we as CAs are always willing to engage in training with FBIs and DOAs if that would be helpful. We're happy to hop on a call or set up a meeting to iron out details of a specific NDA, or if you just want to know more about kind of what's going on in the process. The last thing you want to be is a black box where you submit a request for an NDA and you get one, a week or a month down the line. I think that's all we have. Are there any questions?